Good evening. The Palestinian Return Centre welcomes you to this evening's online panel discussion entitled Britain and Palestine 107 Years of the Ramifications of Balfour. Tonight's panel will be delving into the brief history of the Balfour Declaration, what the declaration itself entailed, the British mandate's role in the implementation of the Balfour Declaration, the British government's celebratory reaction to the anniversary of the declaration every single year, the British government's relations with the Israeli government, and most importantly, how the Balfour Declaration began the erosion of Palestinian human rights that are still being eroded to this day. Our first speaker of tonight's panel discussion is David Cronin. David is an Irish journalist living in Brussels. He is a contributing editor with the Electronic Intifada, a website focused on Palestine. His books include Balfour's Shadow, A Century of British Support for Zionism, and Israel and Europe's Alliance with Israel Aiding the Occupation. He has been known to occasionally put senior Western politicians under citizen's arrest for crimes against humanity. Among those he has apprehended are the former British Prime Minister Tony Blair for the illegal invasion of Iraq and the current European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen for abetting the genocide in Gaza. Over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Farah. Good evening, everybody. Committing a genocide is clearly not enough for a large bloc within Israel's ruling coalition. The far-right ministers in the Israeli government, backed by some members of Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party, are currently intensifying their push for recolonizing Gaza. Their goal of building new settlements in a territory subjected to wholesale destruction is equally despicable and logical. It is in keeping with the logic of the Balfour Declaration, the 1917 document which kickstarted the process whereby a Jewish state would be established in Palestine. Arthur James Balfour, Britain's Foreign Secretary at the time, was under no illusions about what he was doing in issuing his pledge of support for the Zionist movement. His declaration did not specify the contours of the state being envisaged, which he euphemistically described as a national home. Yet the declaration did prove vital in creating facts on the ground, to use more recent Zionist language. That is precisely what Balfour intended. In 1919, so 2 years after the declaration was issued, Balfour wrote a letter to David Lloyd George, then Prime Minister, after an Anglican bishop in Jerusalem had queried British policy towards Zionism. Balfour admitted in that letter that there was a weak point in Britain's position, as it deliberately and rightly declined to accept the principle of self-determination for Palestine. That would mean asking Palestine's indigenous people, whom Balfour called its present inhabitants, for their views. If the present inhabitants were consulted, they would unquestionably give an anti-Jewish verdict, Balfour wrote, adding that we conceive the Jews to have an historic claim to a home in their ancient land, provided that home can be given to them without either dispossessing or oppressing the present inhabitants. It is important to analyse Balfour's choice of words. Before the Balfour Declaration was issued, Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived in Palestine without major hostility and frequently on friendly and harmonious terms. The anti-Jewish verdict that Balfour wished to avoid would not be directed at Jews because of their ethnicity or religion. It would rather be a verdict against a colonization project which would deny basic rights to Palestinians, despite how Britain contended otherwise. The Balfour Declaration was later enshrined in the League of Nations mandate, under which Britain would rule Palestine following World War I. According to a man called Winston Churchill, the declaration must therefore be regarded as one of the facts definitely established by the triumphal conclusion of the Great War. Churchill was an avid supporter of Zionism. In one 1937 discussion on the Balfour Declaration, he spoke about the good fate of England to the Jews, adding, "We are bound by honour, and I think upon the merits to push this thing as far as we can." Pushing this thing as far as we can meant crushing resistance to the Zionist project. During the same 1937 discussion, Churchill sought to justify Britain's approach by saying, "We have every right to strike hard in support of our authority." Churchill personally approved brutal repression. As Colonial Secretary in 1921, Churchill was instrumental in sending a specialized police force to Palestine. It was comprised of men who had previously served in Ireland with the British forces known as the Black and Tans and the Auxiliaries. To this very day, the Black and Tans are synonymous with immense cruelty during Ireland's War of Independence. The Black and Tans set fire to entire neighbourhoods of Cork City and of Balbriggan, my hometown in North County Dublin. As Caroline Elkins writes in her book, Legacy of Violence, Palestine came to replace Ireland as the official and unofficial training ground for colonial police indoctrination. By 1943, 5 out of Palestine's 8 district police commissioners had previously served with the Black and Tans in Ireland. Just this week, David Lammy, Britain's Foreign Secretary, suggested that the seriousness of the term genocide is undermined if it is applied to Israel's current war against Gaza. It is understandable that a senior British politician would try to excuse or downplay Israel's crimes. Israel is, after all, seeking to perfect crimes which it learned from Britain. When Britain ran Palestine, it set up a concentration camp and resorted to home demolitions, to collective punishment, and to imprisonment without trial. Douglas Duff, one of the former Black and Tan members who went on to become a police chief in Palestine, wrote about the torture techniques which he used and possibly pioneered. His memoirs indicate that he introduced the practice we now call waterboarding to Palestine. Israel has kept up the tradition he established. Palestinians arrested by Israeli troops now occupying Gaza may have undergone waterboarding, according to testimony gathered by the United Nations Human Rights Office earlier this year. Arthur James Balfour once expressed a desire to see the strengthening and consolidation of the British Empire. The Balfour Declaration reflected such thinking. It was hoped that Zionism would form for England a little loyal Jewish Ulster in a sea of potentially hostile Arabism, according to Ronald Storrs, a Jerusalem-based military administrator. The irony is that Britain's sponsorship of Zionism helped to weaken the empire. As the Zionist movement felt that colonization was not advancing with sufficient speed, it fell out with Britain in the 1940s. Some elements in the Zionist movement even conducted bombing and assassination campaigns against the British. Concluding that Palestine was unmanageable, the British eventually had to leave that land with their tails between their legs. The British departed Palestine as Zionist forces that they had actually trained were implementing the Nakba, the mass expulsion of Palestinians from their homes. Although the empire has shrunk, many figures in the British establishment still have an imperial mindset. As Israel is a product of Britain's imperial machinations, those British politicians who enable its crimes are maintaining a consistency. Palestinians have paid a horrific price for that consistency. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David, for your contribution there. And if you have, if you're tuning in now and you have any questions for David, there will be a brief Q&A at the end. So please do leave them in the comment section on the live stream you're tuning into. Thank you, David. Our next speaker of tonight's panel discussion is Saeb Shahab. Saeb is an internationally recognized Middle East political expert, an author and a political contributor to many alternative media platforms across the world. Former diplomat, was the Palestine representative in Ireland and headed the Palestine General Delegation to Ireland until 2002. He is the chairman of the Palestine Aid Charity and a co-founder of Irish MAP Medical Aid for Palestine. He was behind the building of the James Connolly Surgical Units in Al Auda Hospital in Gaza City. Saeb is also the coordinator of General of the Road to Hope convoy, which against all odds broke through the Israeli illegal blockade of Gaza and brought medical and humanitarian aid to Gaza's medical facilities on the 28th of November 2010. Saeb's book, The Arabian Gulf States and the International Oil Monopolies, the book proved to be one of the classics to all anti-imperialist domination in the Arab world. Over to you, Saeb.
Hello, everyone. Allow me, just want to get into a little bit of historical background and up to date somewhere. So maybe I'll take a bit longer than. Stop me when you want. I'll start with the French connection. The Zionist entity is an uprooting colonial settler project. It was an idea developed by Napoleon Bonaparte. Some figures during the French Revolution came up with the slogan, which is Jewish emancipation. I call it, it's the most anti-Semitic slogan I ever heard. It was to cleanse Europe from the Jews and to use them in its imperialist design to colonize Palestine and parts of Egypt. Napoleon's campaign against Palestine and Egypt published a call in the French official gazette during the siege of Acre, stating that Bonaparte calls on the Jews to support France and to seize the moment of his presence in Palestine to settle in the area from Acre to Alexandria in Egypt. But this project was defeated by the Palestinians, then the Egyptians. The French were chased out of Palestine, then Egypt. The British Empire picked up on where the French failed. So the British developed design which similar to eject the Jews from Europe to Palestine and to use them as colonial settlers in Palestine to further the British imperial colonial objectives. Ireland became, as I say, the mechanics of genocide for the British. Ireland was the main lab for testing the British settler colonialism, as the English began this process in the 12th century by bringing into Ireland the British farmers and workers to replace the Irish indigenous people by the planters who took over the best of lands and location while pushing the indigenous Irish people to the bogs and mountains. The Zionist entity were engineered to be exact copy actually, of the British colonization of Ireland. As David said, the little loyal Jewish Ulster. Tommy and David are an authority on this subject. Don't want to go any further. What the British learned from the European colonialism in North Africa and South Africa, Australia and France, and the French settler colonialism, especially in Algeria, that is the mechanism as well in here of genocide, since the goal is to control the land and its resources, to expel the indigenous population out of it, to turn Palestine into a piece of West Europe, Judaization of Palestine, the French colonization of Algeria, and settling the French during that period, which is 19th century, turned it into a piece of France while exterminating indigenous people. But at the end of the day, the Algerian won and cleansed them. By installing people on top of people, I always say that one people will vanish. That is actual deployment of genocide. So the Balfour Declaration was a tool in that. The plan was to transfer the European Jews to colonize Palestine, as we said. The British government presented that declaration, the text of it, to the American President Woodward Wilson, who approved it before it was even published. Then the French and Italian as well officially followed suit and approved the declaration. The British occupation developed political structures in Palestine to facilitate the imposition of the British settler colonial regime in Palestine, which is manifested today with the Zionist entity. From the early days, the Palestinians started resisting the British occupation. The Palestinian resistance intensified in facing the British brutalities, the construction of Jewish settler colonial project, and the influx of the Jewish immigration to it. Britain began empowering the Zionist colonial settler people against the owners of the country. They were integrating these Zionist organizations within the institution of the British mandate, which runs Palestine. In 1920, we call it the Jerusalem Revolt or 1920 Revolution. It was a short-lived uprising which erupted against the British and the intensifying of the immigration. In February 27th of 1920, 40,000 Palestinians participated in a demonstration that took place in Jerusalem to protest the British occupation and to call for the withdrawal of the declaration, Balfour Declaration. And their demands added on top of it, the Jewish immigration want to see a stop to it. And they handed their demands to the British diplomats in Jerusalem and European ambassadors as well. Demonstration continued till the 4th of April 1920. The Jerusalem Revolution became widespread revolt against the British occupation forces. But it was the first experience of resistance against colonialism and Zionism that took a popular resistance form in Palestine. But the forces who carried such revolution or uprising were not themselves organized. So in April 1920 in Java, another mass uprising erupted, and they faced the British forces and the Zionist colonial settlers in that city. In 1921, the uprising, another uprising, demanded the withdrawal again of the Balfour Declaration, and they confronted the Zionists. This led to over 47 Zionists to be killed and nearly 68 Palestinians to be martyred. And another one major, which we call it the Burak Revolution, which is named after the Burak Gate, which today call it the Wailing Wall, the 1929 revolution, that the Britain kind of violence and repression against the Palestinians in their cities and villages pushed the Palestinians to the brink. In August 29, the British captured a lot of the participated figures in this revolution. From them till today, and even in our songs, folk songs, we have the names of the three of these leaders of that revolution, called Muhammad Jamjoom, Fuad Hijazi, or Ata Zir. These leaders were hanged by the British, and the population were severely punished, and a lot of areas being destroyed. Who dared its population to resist the British occupation. In 1933 as well, there is a huge demonstration continued for days, and they were expressing their anger against the British policies and their violence against the people, while the British increasing and facilitating the Jewish immigration. That led to a turning point in the Palestinian history, which is 1935 revolution. And this is it's because the Palestinians were at the time become more politically aware in the 30s, and there was a few calls for armed struggle at the time being released by many leaders and groups, and it's become louder after that in response to the British occupation and their brutality against the Palestinians. And the influx as well of the Zionist Jewish immigrants. The British turned their own attention to training these immigrants and to create from them thugs which were attacking these gangs and thugs were attacking the Palestinian farmers, and they were seizing violently the land. So Sheikh Izzuddin al-Qassam has become the first guerrilla leader in Palestine, formed and trained guerrilla fighters, the Al-Qassam brigades, we call them, which today Hamas called its own brigades after him. Al-Qassam brigades began its military campaign against the Zionist colonials groups, and the British patrols as well were targeting anybody who is, they even doubt, close enough to him, because there is a panic become to hit the Zionists and the British circle, since the Qassam armed revolution was a turning point to the Palestinians, has become like a marker in their Palestinian in the Palestinian national movement history. It's paved the way for the revolution to follow, and that a lot of revolutionary movement happened, but the Qassam himself was assassinated in 95, and his comrades continued the struggle. Became after that the major great Palestinian revolution, which is 1936 to 1939. There is a brilliant study by the late Martyr Ghassan Kanafani written on this one. He did a great analysis, and because this was a turning point for the Palestinians. Until that time, with the exception of the Algerian revolution, the Palestinian revolution, or the Palestinian revolt as some call it, and in Palestine we call it the Great Revolution of 1936, it was the longest and largest revolution ever to be carried out by an Arab people against their colonials. The revolution erupted in mid-April 1936, and they declared the Palestinian people a general strike. In spite of the intensification of that general strike, the British authority rejected the Arab-Palestinian demands to halt the Jewish immigration. So the British colonial arrogance publicly challenged the Palestinian, and they issued a new immigration permits to the Jewish agency at the time. So the Palestinian leadership responded by declaring a revolution. In early May 1936, they intensified this civil disobedience against the British and launched, along with it, an armed struggle and violent armed struggle against the British occupation. And there, the Zionist gangs later, after achieving some of the Palestinian kind of revolutionary victories, started to burn villages and towns held by the British. So the revolution itself starts spreading all over Palestine, and the British occupation forces, with its black and tans thugs, began their terror campaign, widening it against the Palestinian. The home demolition policies, which the Israelis today do, is a British one. The burning of the villages, as the Israelis did and just a couple of years ago and last year, and the farms, uprooting farms and massacring people. A lot of things. Thousands were arrested, some of them being hanged. The resistance fighters then launched campaigns to liberate the larger cities in Palestine, and they were assassinating British officers who were controlling the joints of everyday life in Palestine, and they were killing spies and even anybody who's to deal with land sellers. These bloody clashes took place between the Palestinian, even Palestinian women participated against the British army at the time. So the British brought into Palestine a huge, after the enforcement by sea and land and air. They brought them from Cyprus, from Suez Canal, from Habbaniya in Iraq. And 1936, in August 1936, the British forces numbered more than 70,000 in Palestine, plus 40,000 policemen. A lot of them were black and tans, police thugs, in addition to the Zionist gangs who were being trained and they were fighting under the British command. Still, the British failed to defeat or stop the revolution. The British decided then to use the biggest trick, which is this has influenced hugely the Palestinian struggle from that day. They decided to use the Arab rulers, the British puppets at the time. We have to know most of the Arab lands and these rulers, we're going to name them now, were under British control. Iraq, Jordan, or even Egypt, all of that under British occupation. Arabia was engineered by the British, and all of the rulers in it were British control. So they brought the king of Saudi Arabia, at the time Abdul Aziz Al Saud, his name, King Ghazi, king of Iraq, Imam Yahya of Yemen, and Prince Abdullah of Jordan. And the British Empire leadership promised these leaders they're going to do justice to the Arab Palestinians. And the Arab rulers then convinced the Palestinian leaders of the revolt that Britain had responded positively to their demand. So in exchange, they have to stop the revolt. The call of stopping that revolution and the Great Strike was issued by the Arab rulers themselves on the 13th of October 1936. After 6 months, the revolution stopped and the general strike was called off. But what followed? The British occupation broke their own promises, and which they made to the kings of that region at the time. Britain announced that it will go for the partition of Palestine. Large-scale then military clashes broke out between the British occupation troops and the Palestinian rebels, some of which lasted for several days. The rebels were at the time retaking large cities, city of Akka, Akar, Beer Saba, Beersheba, Hebron, El Khalil, Beit Lahab, Beit Sahur, El Majdal, which they call it Ashkelon, and Fallujah, all were liberated by the rebels. During that great Palestinian revolt from 1936 to 1939, the loss of the Palestinian amounted to 8,000 martyrs and 18,000 wounded from the rebels as well. 15,000 martyrs and wounded from the Palestinian civilians. The British mandate by that time, I tell you, when you think of Palestine as a small, tiny country at that time, and with that kind of losses, and with the presence of over 115,000 British between military and black and tan and police, it broke the back of the Palestinians. And they prepared through this campaign of destruction and burning neighborhoods and destroying cities and assassinating a lot of leadership. The British went in a campaign to devastate the Palestinian society. And they actually, at some stage, if there is anybody caught with one bullet, will be hanged. And we have an example of 3 young men in Tul Karim in North Palestine, near Jenin, were executed simply for possessing a few bullets. You cannot imagine how the British worked in destroying the Palestinian communities and society to end the revolution. And we can say it. They inflicted massive Nakba, which is catastrophe in the Palestinian, from 1939. They prepared the ground for the greater catastrophe, or Nakba, as we say, in 1948. If you want to look at the British policies themselves, the British Labour Party in 1994, they say they passed a resolution recommending the displacement of the Palestinians in exchange for receiving large number of the Jews. In 1946, the United States of America declared its support for the colonial settler project in Palestine, which means the Americans say they are supporting the partition of Palestine in 4 areas. The British announced after that an official referral of the question of Palestine to the US on April 2nd of April 1947. So the British Zionist plan of 6 months of ethnic cleansing in Palestine led to uprooting of nearly 800,000 people from their homes, the destruction of 531 villages and towns, the eviction of tens of neighborhoods of large cities through what they call it at the time, the mobile massacres. The Zionist terror gangs occupied over 78% of original area of Palestine. I want to close on this. The number of Jews in Palestine before the British occupation of Palestine estimated at about 50,000. And with the British mandate, it reached 650,000 in 1948. Saying that with the genocide happening in Gaza, which is continuation of the same policies the British engineered and legislated in Palestine, the Palestinian people are there and they are still fighting in their grounds in Gaza, and they are still fighting in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, in 1948. I want to say the Palestinian and historical Palestine amount to 51% of the population, and this population will not be defeated. This population, we promise the free war people of the world, will be victorious at the end, and this Zionist entity will be disassembled and kicked out of Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Saib. Again, just want to remind everyone who's tuning on online, if you do have any questions you would like to ask Saib, David, or Tommy, then please do leave them in the comment section on the live stream. Thank you again, Saib. We'll come back at the end for questions. Our next speaker and the final speaker of today's panel discussion is Tommy McKerney. Tommy is an Irish Socialist Republican. He is also a former member of the IRA and participated in the 1980 hunger strike, spending 53 days without food whilst imprisoned in the H blocks. He is the author of The Provisional IRA, From Insurrection to Parliament, Events, and he's also the joint author of Between Sectarianism and Neoliberalism, The State of Northern Ireland and the Democratic Deficit. And he also writes a regular column for the monthly Socialist Voice. Although not formally a member of any political party, Tommy McKerney has always been actively involved in social, economic, and political issues. Most recently, he has campaigned in support of the besieged Palestinian population of Gaza and the West Bank and supported demands for an immediate ceasefire. Over to you, Tommy.
Thank you, Farah. And thank you for this invitation to speak here this evening. For a start, I'd like to quote from Columbian University professor Rashid Khalidi, America's foremost scholar of Palestine, who has recently stepped down from his position in Columbia University. And in an interview with The Guardian, the British newspaper The Guardian, he is quoted as saying that his next book will focus on Ireland and on how it was a laboratory for Palestine. It stems from a fellowship he had recently carried out at Trinity College Dublin. And he says that to understand Palestine, you have to understand British colonialism more broadly. He's hoping to examine key figures in the British aristocracy whose Irish experience was central to everything they did afterwards. People such as Arthur James Balfour, Sir Charles Taggart, and, interestingly, General Sir Frank Kitson. He's hoping to show how the Irish experience was exported to Egypt, India, and Palestine, and then returned to Ireland during the Troubles. It's the most recent Troubles, obviously, he's talking about. So, with that insight from Professor Khalidi, I'd like to start by saying that I think it's important to ask what reason the British had for establishing the State of Israel. Ask ourselves, was it any admiration or love of the Jewish people? And clearly not. In 1903, Arthur Balfour himself, while Prime Minister, introduced what's known as the Aliens Act, which was designed primarily to prevent Jewish people from Europe entering Britain, indicating that he had little or no love of the Jewish people. In 1906, Joseph Chamberlain, then Prime Minister of Britain, offered to open up a homeland for Jewish people in Africa, in a part of Africa that had been taken into the British Empire by the force of arms, in which they had obviously no right to offer to anyone. But that was turned down by the Zionist Council in Britain as unsuitable for their objectives and aims. The reason that we're asking this question is not because of any admiration or love for the Jewish people by the British establishment. In fact, in many ways, it served quite an anti-Semitic aim, and that was to open up an area outside of Europe even to dispense with their Jewish population's hostility based on anti-Semitism. But more significant than that was the fact that the British saw the establishment of a colony in the Middle East for Jewish people as significantly and strategically important for the empire and its interests. This was along the lines, and I'm going back to taking from Professor Khalidi's insight into Irish history and how it impacted on Palestine. The British saw the creation of a Palestinian state as establishing a virtual garrison, human garrison in the Middle East, in a strategically vital part as far as they were concerned, to safeguard the Suez Canal, to actually act as a protection for British interests in that strategically important part of the world. This had followed as something that our two previous speakers have referred to, the colonisation of Ireland. At the very beginning of the 17th century, following an attempt by the Irish to break the control of England on Ireland, in which they had sought help from Spain, that after having suffered what in 1598 has still regarded as the biggest defeat of Elizabethan arms of the time in a battle called the Yellow Ford, and following the defeat of the Irish insurrection of the time, the English government then decided, English kingdom and government decided to plant a plantation of colonisation of Ulster. This was designed deliberately to create effectively a garrison in Ireland, which would safeguard British interests in Ireland. This policy was followed later on, obviously, in Palestine, where Britain decided to set up not something which would favour necessarily for their, because as I said, not out of any respect or love of the Jewish people, but in order to establish effectively a garrison to protect their interests in the Middle East. Integral to this, of course, is the fact that, as in Ireland, they had created hostility between the colonial settlers and the local and the indigenous population, which is actually very important to their interest of the colonial power, because had the planters or the settlers integrated peacefully with the local population, there would have been no antagonism between them, and therefore they would no longer have served the purpose of the empire. To the same extent, the British had a vested interest in encouraging and maintaining hostility between the Jewish people that they had sent and transported to Palestine, a vested interest in maintaining and continuing with that hostility. Now, the fact is that in terms of bloodshed and devastation, and it's interesting to note that local resistance in Ireland has been echoed by resistance from Palestine, and the subsequent devastation wrought upon resistance in Ireland can be echoed and seen here again in Palestine. Let me just quote from a historian, Arthur Leckey, who carried out an investigation into behaviour by the British, or sorry, the English, actually to be precise, who were assisting in England at the time in their attempts to subdue Ireland under the leadership of the Lord Protector, Oliver Cromwell, who 40 years after the original plantation had begun, following in 1641 uprising from the Irish, which in some ways is similar to the October 7th uprising in Gaza, when out of exasperation and brutality and resistance to horrendous treatment, Irish indigenous rebelled against the colonial settlers, and this was the excuse for brutal response from the English. And on one occasion, Cromwell, as reported by Anthony Wood, who accompanied Cromwell, related that in a town called Drogheda, Cromwell related that 3,000 were slain, including women and children, hiding in vaults underneath the church. All were put to the sword. 3,000 put to the sword, many of them women and children, hiding in the vaults of a church. I mean, that has echoes today in the genocidal behaviour of the Israeli army in Gaza and the West Bank and in Lebanon. The pattern emerges that not only is it in the interests of the empire to maintain and contain and remain, but they use the same techniques that have been used and practiced in Ireland. Our first speaker, David, mentioned Churchill, who compared Palestinians to the dogs in the manger. Churchill said, "I do not admit that the dog in the manger has the final right to the manger, even though he may have lain there for a long time. I do not admit that right. I do not admit, for instance, that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America or the black people of Australia. I do not admit that a wrong has been done to these people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, prime race, more worldly wise race, put it that way, has come in, taken their place. I do not admit it. They have not the right, nor have they the power." Very blunt, racist analysis coming from Churchill himself, which epitomizes the attitude that the same attitude that Israeli politicians have today to Palestinians, likening them to dogs. So from Britain has came that same lessons, as we pointed out on several occasions here tonight, that the treatment being meted out today, one, has been acquired from Britain, continues, but the logic is to maintain the hegemony of imperialism, and it's not out of any admiration or love for the Jewish population. The continuation of the state of Israel is dependent not so much on the Israeli army, but on support from the imperialism. Britain had decided to create, as they called it, a homeland for Jews in Palestine and expel the Palestinian population. As Balfour himself had said, 2 years after his declaration offering European Jews a national home in Palestine, he asserted that Zionism, he said, is a root in age-long tradition and present needs, future hopes of a far profounder importance than the desires and prejudices, as he described it, of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land. So, content, willing, determined to expel at least 700,000 Arabs or Palestinians from their ancient homeland to protect it for the interests of the empire, something that continues to this very day. But the British, having lost their significance and power in the world, handed over to the US empire. The United States empire today is the primary supporter of Israel. And that's just a lesson maybe in this before I conclude, that as the British Empire declined, and has declined, and is no longer the global superpower that it was at the beginning of the 20th century, when it launched its campaign to found the State of Israel, that now we're seeing that Britain is now putting a distance between itself and Northern Ireland, where it set up the State of Northern Ireland actually to protect its interests, its strategic and security interests. That as the British Empire has declined, so has its interest and ability to control Ireland, and it's now willing to release at some stage the north of Ireland, Northern Ireland. Someday, as the American Empire declines and recedes, so too will its influence over Israel. Israel will be then left in a situation where it's without the support of the United States. The United States will be unable to do it, and just as happened to the Unionist population in Northern Ireland, so will happen to the Zionist population in Israel. And then at that stage find themselves in a situation very similar to unionism in Northern Ireland today. So thank you for that, and good evening.
Thank you so much, Tommy, for your contribution there. Can we please bring back all the speakers for a Q&A? So now we have Tommy, David, and Saeb just to answer a few questions before we wrap up today's discussion. So we've got a few different questions coming in, so I'm going to kind of round them up a little bit. So one question is focusing on the British government today, Keir Starmer's government, his stance, his role, the British government's role, the British state's role, in what we're currently seeing happening in Gaza, and also comments on David Lammy's approach to it too. So I think we'll come to that first, and then we'll go on to the second question, which will focus more on the Irish government's stance as of the past, now 1 year and 1 month. So could we please start maybe with Saeb, and then David, then Tommy, if that's okay?
Okay, no problem. So the question is about the British government rule in Gaza.
1 second, if it's possible, could everyone mute their mics if they're not speaking, if that's okay? Just the speaker have their mic unmuted. Perfect. Over to you, Sam.
Okay. The question is about the British role in Gaza and what David Lammy was saying about you cannot call what's happening in Gaza genocide. The British, when you ask a child over 10 years of age in Gaza a question and they look in the skies, what's happening in the skies in Gaza, the child in Gaza streets will tell you this drone is a quadcopter with a sniper. This is a drone which is targeting an area before F-16 strike. And this is the British spying aeroplane which surveilling the whole place. So when a child can identify a British spying plane in the skies of Gaza, it says it all. It says what the British are doing in Gaza and involved. The British issued many statements saying they have their sorties over Gaza, information sorties, let's say, over Gaza, just to help in identifying the captives. And the British say only two of the captives, Jewish soldiers or Israeli soldiers, have a British citizenship. So when you look at some investigating journalists, British investigating journalists, say put with the hours, how many hours of flights the British had over Gaza, just that for the sake of two, you cannot believe it. To me, my own take on that, the whole Western governments under the American control are doing, as we seen in the 8th of October. They rushed all of them to assure the Zionist entity that they have the backing of every government in the West, what arsenals of weapons open to them, and this is led by the Americans and the British, and then the Germans, then the French, then a lot, even Romanian, Italians, all of that. So West Europe, led by the British, the French, the Germans in this, are doing what the Americans ordering them to sustain the Zionist entity. As the British looked at it as it's an imperial outpost for them to control the region, it still exists to the British and to the Americans and Western imperialists as that. Whatever we heard Netanyahu a couple of days ago when he was addressing the winter session of the Knesset, when he said we had a devastating and a massive blow, shook them, and it was like a kind of a killer, that kind of knock they got from Gaza. Remember, the people from the resistance in Gaza is 1,200 fighters who shook that state. If the whole entire imperialist project in the Middle East took 1,200 fighters to show it can collapse that quick, I think it won't last that long. With Lamy saying it's not genocide, he wanna call it what? Massacres? What he wanna call it? Annihilation and slaughter? Whatever he wants to call it, he can call it. But the people on the ground in Gaza, as the children, as I say, they seen the great work of the British establishment in killing their own people.
Over to you, David.
Thanks. A few years ago, Keir Starmer said, "I support Zionism without qualification." That was obviously before he became Prime Minister. But since he has become Prime Minister, he has continued to support Zionism pretty much without qualification. Okay, there has been some minor qualifications. His Foreign Secretary, the aforementioned David Lammy, announced relatively recently that Britain was halting a very small number of arms export licenses. But David Lammy was abundantly clear that Britain was not moving towards a weapons embargo. He explicitly rejected calls for a weapons embargo on Israel. He interestingly made it clear, but both Tommy and Saib have talked about US support for Israel. David Lammy made it clear that the joint weapons production between Britain and the United States that ends up being sent to Israel, we're talking particularly about the F-35 fighter jets that have been very important in this genocide, that joint cooperation between Britain and the United States will continue. If you remember, I'd just say a tiny bit about the disgraceful silence of the British mainstream media. If we think back to the early stages of the current genocide, there was an interesting story that appeared, I think it was actually published by the Socialist Worker website. It was about the SAS being in Cyprus and making preparations to intervene on Israel's side in the current genocide. The British government responded to that story by sending out gag orders, or officially called D notices, to British newspapers, British media, telling them not to report such information. The British media, supposedly this great investigative British media, including newspapers like The Guardian, have been disgracefully obedient towards such calls. Saib mentioned the spy planes flying over Gaza, being flown from Britain's so-called sovereign military bases in Cyprus. The British media, the mainstream media, is not reporting on this. It has been left pretty much exclusively to a website called Declassified UK and to one particularly excellent journalist called Matt Canard to report on these spy planes from British spy planes being flown from Cyprus over Gaza. The British media has been disgracefully silent on the complicity of the British state in the current genocide.
100%. And even just to echo, you mentioned, you just started your answer there with a quote from Keir Starmer, and one quote that sticks with me as well. A few years before he took office, he was addressing an annual meeting of Labour Friends of Israel, and he opened this conference by repeating Zionist tropes, that Israel made the desert bloom, how he was proud to be a Zionist, the same sentiment you had mentioned, and even referencing how his wife has relatives that live in illegal settlements. So the connections are there, and you can clearly see how he's taken. He's already, in the few months he's been in office, has taken those opinions and put them into actions that would be favorable in Israel's interests. Over to you, Tommy.
Yes, well, listen, anybody that has watched the news, limited though it may be, films from Gaza, I can't see how you can interpret what's happening there as anything other than genocide. 40,000, 43,000 dead, acknowledged, possibly as many more again buried without their bodies being retrieved. More explosives, US manufactured explosives dropped on Gaza than was greater power than several atomic bombs, atomic attack on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And now the Israeli parliament have decided to expel UNRWA, so that starvation, drought, to stop the spread of disease. Polio has now come back. How can anybody describe it anything other than a genocidal attack? It defies credulity to say that there's anything other than a genocide. We've also heard from certain US-based personalities how they have been admiring the coast part of Gaza, planning to build golf clubs. Honestly, we can tell who has an interest in building golf clubs, resorts along the shore. This is clearly genocide, clearly a genocidal policy. There's no accident. The objective was to drive the Palestinian population out of the area. At the early days of the conflict, the most recent conflict, because there's been a conflict in that area now since the mandate was set up. But the most recent conflict, one of the Netanyahu's ministers, the name eludes me now because I can't pronounce it, but described expelling the Palestinians either to, ominously, to Sinai or to Ireland. Comment which echoed an old comment from Ireland here, when Oliver Cromwell, who I've quoted earlier, said people were to go to hell or Connacht. But it's clear the Midlands and the prosperous lands of Ireland. So the same policy is underway. Now, why Britain would deny it? Well, I mean, we don't use the term perfidious Albion lightly. It's well earned, and Britain would deny what's happening. It's well established that the British ruling class's ability for hypocrisy is well established. I don't think we need to go into that any longer, or much to any great detail. They have denied their involvement across the globe. British history is not even taught. A history of the empire is not taught, as Caroline Aikens has pointed out in her book, and many others. The empire has been glossed over. And very recently, Janik has talked about the value of the empire. Stalmer, out of the Commonwealth countries, refuses to acknowledge the debt that they owe to the poor people of the colonies. So why Britain would deny, Lamy would deny genocide now, we don't even need to ask the question. Perfidious Albion, back as bold, brazen, and as treacherous as ever.
Thank you, Tommy. Could we also jump into, because I've just noticed now Miriam unfortunately couldn't join us, that all the speakers are either based in Ireland or Irish. Is it possible to touch on the Irish government's stance the past 1 year and 1 month since the genocide began in October, or this latest stage of genocide, should I say, started in October? Could we delve into their stance and other political party stances also online as well? Should we do the same order? So start with David and Tommy, would that be okay?
Let me say before that, continuing on the British, when we heard the International Court of Justice asking the states, the non-state actors and the state actors, of doing their best to not help Israel in committing what they call a plausible genocide by arming, by financing, by all of that. So the British, they found themselves implicated in that. So of course they wanna. We heard the other government before the Labour, they were even denying and against the International Criminal Court. They are against it, and they were taking legal procedures to stop it. But suddenly, with this new government, they change. They withdraw their objection from against the International Criminal Court. With the International Court of Justice, the British, they say, everybody knows, a child in the street knows from what they see in social media, there is genocide live on TV and social media. So there is implication for the British politicians. And in the future, it's like Nuremberg court when they start bringing the Nazis. In the future, a year, 2, 10, 100, it will be called, and governments and policies were responsible will be held accountable. As I said, you know, the Palestinian people are not defeated, even with that genocide. It will take time, but at some stage, those governments will be accountable. Going to the Irish government, and one of the things we have to say, Palestine and the Palestinian people are so proud of the Irish support on the streets for them. And they are proud to see such a nation like the Irish nation is standing by them. But I am ashamed, as someone who lives in Ireland, to see the level the Irish politicians, many Irish politicians, seeped into. The Irish government was saying that yesterday on the Brest TV, and I said, whatever you heard about Simon Harris saying such and such, and whatever you hear from them, the recognition of Palestine, the things you have to take against the Zionist entity, it's all rubbish. Because at the end of the day, there is one piece of legislation in the Irish Parliament, in the Dáil, it's called the Occupied Territories Bill, and they've been delaying it. Why it's not going to be put in the floor to be go for the first, the second, the third reading, and voted in, which is to punish the settlers, to start developing sanctions against the Zionist entity. Ireland and Spain and the Slovenia or the other Belgium or the other countries who recognize the state of Palestine, the Palestinians, they have more recognition than the Zionist entity. The Palestinians want to see action, as the Zionist entity see actions from the collective West behind it, with the cash, with weapons, and that. We don't ask anybody to give us any cash or any weapons. We're asking them to be truthful to their own people, to the popular demand, and to what they saying. Why the Irish government doesn't develop a kind of sanction policy against a genocide, which is believes it's happening and they can't see it? Why the Irish government is not stopping the what they call it, the favorite trade kind of policy the EU given to the Zionist entity? There's a lot of things we can say. As well, I blame a lot of Irish journalists who's been invited from the 90s onwards for free trips to Tel Aviv and to enjoy holidays and this and that, and suddenly they become mouthpieces for the Zionist entity. Let them enjoy the blood on their hands. There's a lot of things Ireland have to do as well. Thank you.
Can we jump to David, please?
Well, I think it's important to always remember that Ireland is a member of the European Union, and it sees itself as being sort of a good pupil in the European Union. It always wants to be the best in the class, so to speak. And in that context, the Irish government signed up to an absolutely disgraceful statement, common European Union statement from the middle of October last year. That statement portrayed Israel's genocide as it was getting underway in Gaza as an act of self-defense. By doing so, the European Union gave Netanyahu and the other thugs in the ruling Israeli coalition very valuable time to present the genocide as essentially defensive. Micheál Martin, the Irish foreign minister at the time, even went on a propaganda trip organized by Israel around that time and essentially voiced his solidarity with Israel as it was committing a genocide in Gaza. Perhaps in some respects, the Irish position has improved a little bit since that, from a very low level since then. So I've mentioned the Occupied Territories Bill, which is the legislation that would introduce a ban on goods from Israel's illegal settlements in the occupied West Bank in Ireland. We have to remember that this legislation was passed democratically by both houses in the Oireachtas, the Irish Parliament, but it has been blocked in a very anti-democratic manner by Fine Gael, the one of the major parties in Ireland. The reason why the Fine Gael party blocked it was because it claimed that under European Union legislation, it was not unable to introduce such a ban. That analysis, to be very charitable, was contradicted by many people who actually know about European Union law and know a lot more about international law than senior figures in the Irish government do. Fortunately, because of pressure and possibly because there's an election expected in the south of Ireland very soon, the Irish government has changed its position a little bit, and it actually asked the Attorney General in Ireland to give fresh advice about this legislation, and it appears now that the Attorney General has advised that this legislation can actually be placed on the Irish statute books and can actually be enforced. It won't actually come into effect, however, until after the general election, which is expected sometime next month or in December. So it is moving in the right direction on that particular dossier. However, there's another important matter: the question of weapons, ammunitions flying through Irish airspace. Ireland is supposed to be a neutral country. It's outside NATO. Yet a huge amount of weaponry, a huge amount of ammunition has flown and is continuing to fly through Irish airspace. This has not been revealed by the mainstream media in Dublin. Instead, it has been revealed by a group of courageous journalists working for a website called the Ditch. I wouldn't say what they're known as in Leinster House, the Irish Parliament, because they're very unpopular, as you can imagine, with Irish politicians, because they've consistently done their job seriously and exposed the corruption of many Irish politicians. Just earlier today, actually just before this meeting began, I saw that some lawyers are preparing a challenge to the transport of weapons and ammunitions for Israel through Irish airspace. The Irish government has tried to claim that it can do nothing about this. Eamon Ryan, the Irish transport minister, has tried to claim that first of all, I think he tried to pretend that he knew nothing about it. Now he's trying to claim that he can't do anything about this. So I would wish every success to the lawyers who are preparing a legal challenge to the quite disgraceful Irish position.
And over to you, Tommy.
Yes, I think the Irish Dublin government's position is one of entire cynicism. They have recognised the fact that there's a vast majority of the Irish people sympathetic to the Palestinian plight and understand the desperate straits in which the Palestinian people in Gaza and the West Bank find themselves, particularly the devastating genocidal attack on the Palestinian people in Gaza. And it has drawn an enormous response from the grassroots, both north and south of the border. But even the Dublin government, the Irish government in Dublin, is cynical is because it's beholden effectively to both the European Union and American imperialism. One of the great scandals is the use by the US military of Shannon Airport to bring regular flights through Shannon Airport without any inspections done whatsoever. And this started long before the most recent conflict in Gaza, where it's believed that extraordinary renditions were facilitated through Shannon Airport. But of late, there's a reasonable reason to believe that munitions have been, the US military and the US Air Force has used Shannon to transport munitions to Israel, and certainly if not to Israel itself, into Cyprus, from where they have been then moved on to Israel. And the Irish government is cravenly refusing to act on that. The fact that the Irish government has been in Washington supping, drinking, celebrating with genocide Joe Biden is an indictment on their behaviour. And the point about this also is that not only is the Irish government pretending to be sympathetic to Palestinians because as David has pointed out, there's an election coming within the next few weeks, but they have been very careful to, if you like, attempt to walk two sides of the road at the same time. But unfortunately, it's not just confined to the government itself, but to the main opposition party has shown itself to be devoid of principle. And last St. Patrick's Day, the leadership of Sinn Féin, who claimed to be staunchly supportive of Palestine, went to Washington to wine and dine along with the President, Joe Biden, and his accomplices, therefore effectively endorsing their campaign against the Palestinian people. So we're talking about a cynical political class, conscious of the grassroots support there is for Palestine, which is quite enormous. Almost, I think many agree, one of the most active and largest support bases outside of the Middle East for the Palestinian people. And on that basis, the Irish political class has to take consideration of that, but at the same time not moved in any direction, which is very disappointing.
Thanks so much, Tommy. Thank you, Saib, and thank you, David, for your invaluable contributions to this evening's panel discussion. And thank you to everyone online. I just wanted to wrap up again with a massive thank you to all three of our speakers. And also just a reminder to everyone tuning in online to keep up to date with upcoming PRC events, which you can find all on the Palestinian Return Center's Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram page. And just keep up to date with any events coming up and all the actions and updates from PRC. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you again.
Thank you.